Welcome to part 2 of Kingdom Plantae.
We left off in our last video talking about how plants were able to shift from water to land and what some of the challenges as well as risks and rewards of that shift entailed. We also introduced that there were 4 large groups in terms of different types of plants. And we introduced the first type, which were the non-vascular plants, known as the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. And then we finally left off with introducing the idea of what is vascular tissue and in what ways can plants benefit.
So, if we look at our classification of plants, that means we have talked about our non-vascular plants. And the next thing we need to talk about is our vascular plants with no seeds. So our first type of vascular plant were the ferns and their relatives. Now, these ferns, because of this vascular tissue, allowed them to grow really big. They were able to grow roots, which allowed them to anchor themselves into the soil. And they had specialized tissue, the roots, that could absorb and transport water. There were also leaves, which were able to increase the surface area. And if we have an increased surface area, then you're able to perform more photosynthesis, which means more sugar, which means the organism can grow bigger. And so for the period of time, these plants were very successful. They dominated the Carboniferous period, these large ferns and their relatives. And these plants came about 300 million years ago. And the other thing I wanted to point out is these plants also were able to develop those mycorrhizal relationships with the funguses. And so not only were they thriving in terms of this new vascular structure, but they were also developing symbiotic relationships with other organisms. Now, these early or primitive vascular plants are still seedless, which means there are still limitations to what these ferns can accomplish. They still have swimming sperm, which means they still need to exist in those moist, damp areas or environments. But despite that, some of the successful adaptations of these seedless vascular plants is that they now have leaves specialized for photosynthesis. They have this vascular tissue that allows them to move things like water, nutrients, minerals, glucose. And they also have more specialized tissues that allow them to do specific functions, like to store water, which is important for plants growing in more arid regions or dry regions. There are a number of different types of seedless vascular plants. I'm going to be focusing on 4 a little bit. First, we have the whisk ferns, or the psilotophytes. There's no leaves, and they actually don't have roots either. They have those rhizomes instead. And they kind of look like brooms. They have these sort of long fingering projections that kind of look like the end of a broom. Next up, we have our club mosses, or lycopodophytes. These ones look a lot like moss, but they're not moss. You can see them down here in the right. They kind of look like tiny wee evergreen trees. They're different from mosses because they actually have a true root system, whereas, remember, those mosses have those rhizomes, same as those whisk ferns. And these club mosses will also have stems. Another group of seedless vascular plants are the horsetails or sphenophytes. They're known as living fossils because they are the only remaining genus of what was a sort of a once diverse group of organisms. And you can see an example on the right over here. They used to get really, really big, so they could be tree-sized, but now what we see are much smaller organisms, and they can get about a meter in height. And finally are ferns, or pteridophytes. This is arguably the group that we will talk about the most, and they're also the ones you're probably most familiar with. Ferns cover the forest floor in many parts of Canada. And like I said earlier, or maybe it was the last video, these ferns dominated the forests of the Carboniferous period. They were very successful. And remember, they're one of the first plants to sort of access height. And so they got all of the benefits that came with accessing that height. These ferns have true roots, stems, leaves, and they also have this waxy outer layer, or epidermis, that helps to reduce loss of water. So if we're keeping that water in the leaves, then it's not evaporating. Another important aspect of these leaves in preventing water loss is the stomata. And these stomata are basically openings in the leaf that control what can get in and out of the tissue. Now, what I've put up on the screen is a picture of a fern that you might see out in the wild. And what you can see is the underside of the frond, or the leaves. And those little black or brown dots, those are called sporangium, and they're going to be the things producing spores. In our last lesson, we talked about the alternation of generation of the moss plant. Well, here we're going to be talking about the life cycle of the fern. And so just like the moss plant, the fern also has that alternation of generation, which just means that for part of its life, it is going to be haploid, and for part of its life, it's going to be diploid. Now, with the moss, the generation that was dominant was actually the gametophyte generation, but in this case, it's the sporophyte generation. And this shouldn't surprise you too much, because if we take a look at the images here, we see these big fronds of a fern. And so that is where this plant will spend most of its life cycle. It's going to look like a fern. So we just finished talking about the undersides of the leaves. And so on these undersides, we have those little brown dots called the sporangium. And these sporangium are going to undergo meiosis, and they're going to produce spores. So the sporophyte generation is going to be producing spores. These spores are haploid. They're N, which means they have half the genetic information. So they're not full, they're not diploid, they're haploid, they're half. And what's going to happen to these spores is eventually they're going to germinate, and they're going to produce a gametophyte, so a wee little young gametophyte, which will eventually grow, and that gametophyte will develop sex organs. In this case, these sex organs are going to be called archegonia and antheridia. And so, like any good sex organ, they're going to be producing eggs and sperm. And these eggs and sperm are still haploid, so they still contain half the amount, or half the genetic information. When the sperm and eggs fuse together, you get fertilization. And that will result in a young sporophyte, which again is diploid. So a sporophyte is diploid. We then get a mature sporophyte, which will produce spores, and we cycle through the life cycle. So that's it for our seedless vascular plants. Now we move on to vascular plants that do have seeds. Now there are some evolutionary advantages to plants that have seeds. The seed itself has this structure where on the outside there's this hard protective coating which help to prevent the tissue from drying out. Inside the seed is some structures, but there's also storage tissue to help sustain growth. And because of these things, unlike spores that have this short lifetime, seeds can actually exist in dormancy for much longer. The embryo is protected and can just sort of wait until conditions are better. In addition to that, seeds can be dispersed more widely than spores, whether it's through the wind, water, or carried away by animals. Now, when we are talking about vascular plants with seeds, there are two types. The first is our gymnosperms, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was a familiar term to you, because one of the most recognizable gymnosperm are conifers. In this area of the world, gymnosperms are usually conifers, and they produce cones. So up here in the right, you see a happy little pine tree that has produced a cone. The seeds are actually on the cone itself, so on the scales of the cone. And so some examples of trees you might be familiar with would be pines, firs, spruces, yews, cedars, redwoods, and lots of other large trees. Okay, let's take a moment to look at the sort of life cycle of this conifer over here. So we have a mature sporophyte. Okay, so our big tree is a sporophyte. And remember, our sporophyte is going to be diploid, so it's going to have a full set of chromosomes, and it's going to be producing spores. And so what we have is let me grab the right color. We have a female cone, ovulate cone, and a male cone, pollen cone. So the ovulate cone is going to be producing female spores, and the pollen cone is going to be producing male spores. If we track the female spore over here, this is right here, this brown blob, is the scale of one of these ovulate or female cones. And on it, you can see that, that female spore. What the pollen cones, or the male cones, are going to do is they're going to release their spores, and the pollen or spores are going to go to the female cone. These two different male-female spores are going to fertilize, and the end product of that fertilization is actually going to be a seed. And then, of course, that seed can go on and grow another happy little tree. And boy, did those trees get big. There is a huge variety in terms of size of trees. I don't know if anyone has been to the redwood forests or the, sequoia forests, but these trees get big, not only in height, but also in width of tree trunk. We have a few different types of gymnosperms, so it's not just the conifers, although those are the ones that you would be most familiar with, because they form the vast forests in colder regions. So Canada, no surprise. because they have these seeds, they are able to reproduce without the presence of water because, the seeds can travel. These conifers also have a thick bark to help them prevent any water loss from happening. There are some other physical characteristics that help them do good things in the winter. Like, because they're sort of cone-shaped, it helps to snow and ice to fall off of them very easily. And the needle-like leaves have a thick cuticle that help to prevent water loss. There's also the group Nettophyta or nettophytes. There's only about 70 species in this group, and they're quite rare, found in southern Africa. They look nothing like conifers. I encourage you to type it into Google and see a picture for yourself. Two other groups are the Cycadophytes and the Ginkgophytes. The Cycadophytes are about 100 species in the tropics, and these particular species once dominated the Earth. But as climate has changed, so too has their presence. The Ginkgophyta, well, sad story. There is only one living species, the Ginkgo biloba. This is a very old species. All other species in this group is actually extinct, and these ginkgo trees are thought to have many positive benefits and uses. Okay, last up on our Kingdom Plantae tour of groups, we have the angiosperms. So both gymnosperms and angiosperms are seed-producing vascular plants. But where gymnosperms will have cones, angiosperms use a different method. Our angiosperms are our flowering plants. So really quickly, just think, do you have a favorite flower? Right now, I'm a little bit particular to my lilacs. They smell really good. They grow in the spring. Purple, white flower. I'm a big fan of sunflowers. Those grow towards, August, September. But you know what? Humans aren't the only thing that likes flowering plants. So do the birds and the bees. There are tons of insects and birds that are drawn to these bright colors. Now, angiosperms are plants that protect their seeds with the body of a fruit. These fruit will take lots of different shapes and forms and sizes, so they're not all going to be fruit that are edible to us, but there's going to be some sort of fruit. And this fruit acts as a bribe to animals and other creatures, animals are creatures, that will want to eat the fruit and then carry the seed away. So this new innovation has been very successful for these organisms. There's about 235,000 species of angiosperms compared to maybe 700 gymnosperms. These angiosperms will include lots of different things like vines, grasses, shrubs, trees, and water plants. Anything that's going to produce flowers. They will grow everywhere on land. This group can be divided into monocots and dicots. So when we're talking about monocots and dicots, these two types of angiosperms get their name from the number of embryonic leaves in its seed. So monocots or monocotyledons have one leaf or embryonic leaf because it's named mono, whereas dicots or dicotyledon will have two because so two embryonic leaves. And you can see that hopefully right here-ish. So there's just one leaf there. And here we have 2 embryonic leaves. There are some other differences between monocots and dicots that you're going to need to know. The other one that is visible in this image is what the root structure looks like. So over here we have very fibrous roots. There's lots of sort of long, tendrous, fibrous roots in the monocots, but if we go look at the dicots, then they have something called a taproot, which is one main root system down the middle with smaller secondary roots branching off from it. And so these are 2 different root systems that the monocots and dicots will use. A third difference between monocots and dicots is the shape of their leaves. Sorry, not the shape of the veins in the leaves. If you look at a leaf, there are these veins. Just like your hands have veins, so do leaves. And so in monocots, the veins are usually parallel. So they run alongside each other up the leaf, parallel. Whereas if you look at the veins of a dicot, then the veins follow a more net-like structure. They're sort of more webbed in a way. One difference in monocots and dicots that wasn't observable in the last one was the flower shape. Well, not shape. In monocots, we have flowers that are usually in multiples of 3. But in dicots, or eudicots, you'll also see, the flowers are usually in multiples of 4 and 5. One last difference is the way the xylem and phloem are bundled in things like the root and stem. But we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about plant transport. That is it for our part 2 of Kingdom Plantae lesson. A few things we talked about. We talked about our seedless vascular plants, what this vascular tissue afforded the ferns and their relatives. We talked about the life cycle or alternation of generation of the fern. And then we went into the seed plants. We talked about the advantages of the seeds and the 2 different groups of plants that produce seeds, the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now, of course, the gymnosperms are those conifers, and so we talked about what their seed sort of looks like. And the angiosperms, we talked about how it can be broken down into 2 different groups, the dicots and monocots. And that is basically it for our Kingdom Plantae. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck.